Who am I?
Richard Kazimer, media veteran.
Why I got in radio is because I'm good with a knife.
Contributor in Perth, Australia.
Our friend Richard Kazimer in the United States.
How are you guys enjoying the 19th century? Is that working out for you? How can you say, I'm not making fun of you as a race, I'm making fun of you as black performers?
I think as a country, Americans are as patriotic as the most rabid UK football hooligan.
Who am I?
Richard S. Kazimer. Well, the big question this morning, have I set him at Mission Impossible? Probably not, but I'd have to say we've probably set him mission a little bit more difficult than it has been in the past few weeks this morning. Anyway, we are talking about our friend Richard Kazimer from the United States. If you'd like to be his friend on Facebook, all you need to do is look up Richard S. Kazimer. Kazimer, by the way, spelled Kazimer. And he'll be friends with just about anybody except the taxman, or in his language, the IRS. Good morning, sir.
I've not had that much trouble with the IRS. I pay my taxes, and they've been very helpful on occasion.
You probably haven't had any trouble with the IRS for the same reason I haven't had any trouble with the tax office. I never earn enough to be of concern.
They feel sorry for us.
Yeah. Now, something that's it's very much an emotional issue here. And we have seen part the Northern Territory actually enacted legislation that would allow this to occur. The government of the day then enacted legislation using the external affairs powers of the federal constitution to overturn it. We're talking about euthanasia, something that's always been quite topical. And I don't know why. For some reason I thought, I wonder what the issue is in the United States as far as euthanasia is concerned. How's the debate gone there?
No pun intended, it has died out from years past. Now, to date, only 3 states, Oregon in 1994, Montana, and Washington State in 2008, allowed physician-assisted suicide. Now, these Death with Dignity Acts were put into effect by voter referendum. The states didn't arbitrarily enact it. These were put up to a vote, and the voters voted those Death with Dignity Acts in. In all of these states, it requires that the patient must be of sound mind when requesting assisted suicide, as confirmed by a doctor and by other witnesses. And the patient must be diagnosed with a terminal illness. Now, a terminal illness means that the patient has no more than 6 months to live. 2 witnesses, 1 non-doctor unrelated to the patient, must confirm the patient's request, and the patient must make a second request after 15 days of the initial request. Through the years, many other states have assisted suicide referendums on the ballots, but they were all voted down except for the 3 states that I just mentioned.
So which were those 3 states again?
Oregon, Montana, and Washington State.
You kind of think now Montana, I get the impression, is an agricultural state, correct me if I'm wrong, and you're talking about Washington State and Oregon, you kind of get the impression, certainly Washington would probably be a bit of a conservative state. Oregon, I think, is probably a bit different, but I must say the real surprise in there, for me anyway, is Montana.
Montana is big sky country, that's cattle. It may seem a little surprising, but it's also a very older generation, maybe a cowboy mentality that they like to do the things that they want to do. Oregon and Washington State, now Washington State rather, not Washington, D.C., both of those states, Oregon.
Yeah, we're talking about on the western side of the country, yes?
In the Pacific Northwest, those are actually very liberal states.
Oh, okay.
Liberal leaning. I want to mention, too, that in 1999, Texas passed what is called the futile care law. That allows hospitals and physicians legal authority without fear of prosecution to remove life support from terminally ill patients when treatment is considered futile or inappropriate.
I suppose one of the most famous cases, which I suppose in some respects was effectively a euthanasia case, was the case of Terri Schiavo in Florida. And I guess that's the impression that a lot of people around the world got of how the US is dealing with the whole euthanasia thing. As a total, looking at the whole 50-state scenario, how does the United States deal with this, with the exception of those 3 states you mentioned?
There's a difference between physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. In physician-assisted suicide, that's when someone is cognizant enough to request their own demise. They request a physician to end their life with dignity. Euthanasia, on the other hand, is where someone is incapacitated, cannot speak for themselves, such in the case of Terri Schiavo. They have their family step in and have life support removed for them and then let them die on their own. That's when things get heated up, when you've got conflicting members of the families. In Terri Schiavo's case, it was her ex-husband that wanted her removed and the family didn't. Then you've got religious groups and right-to-lifers come in. Generally what happens is that those end up in the courts. In the case of Terri Schiavo, it actually ended up an act of Congress And it got very heated, got very political, and she ended up passing away anyway of starving to death. How that happens, I mean, that's one of those, I don't want to say a dirty little secret, but it's one of those things that it's between a patient or the patient's family and their primary care physician. Are these happening more than we're aware of? Absolutely. There have been polls taken where doctors have been asked, have you assisted in a physician-assisted suicide in a state where it's not legal? And a majority of physicians say yes, probably more than they will admit to it.
Is it something that a doctor does actively, even in those states where it's allowed, Washington, Oregon and Montana? Is it something that a doctor does actively to end a person's life, or is it by the withdrawal of some medication or something like that that they cause the person's demise? Is it, and that I suppose is where the debate comes in, whether you're talking about somebody who actively takes a step to end a person's life. One of the biggest advocates, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, that certainly speaks on the subject quite a bit down here, is a guy called Dr. Philip Nitschke. And I kind of imagine that he must have appeared in the United States somewhere along the line, because I would imagine that the First Amendment would be very convenient for him, because of course a lot of his material here is blocked from publication.
Yes, as a matter of fact, he is setting up shop over here. I saw his name come up in the research. He's going to be making himself known here shortly. In answer to your question, yes, on both accounts. It can be where a doctor gives the order or gives the okay from a family member to turn off the life support machine. Doctors are also able to prescribe medication for a patient who is currently suffering from a terminal illness and give them as much medication as they need, a fatal dose. So yes, it does happen, but only in the states where it is legal can a physician, and they can opt out, where the hospital or a physician can opt not to meet that patient's request.
In the case of that, is it something that must be done with a doctor? If, for example, somebody said, okay, the hospital won't help me, but a family member will, where does that sit legally?
That is illegal.
Gotcha. So actually, we're not talking about euthanasia as such. We're talking about a point where a doctor, for example, I guess, could prescribe some analgesic or something to a greater level, which obviously might hasten somebody's demise, or the family can say turn off the life support system. That's probably a world away from what the advocates like Dr. Philip Nitschke are advocating, where somebody takes something that actively ends their life. So I guess what we're talking about is taking what you're talking about here is doctors taking action, which by its very nature is going to shorten somebody's life, as opposed to taking action which is going to end the person's life there and then, with the possible exception, I guess, of turning off a life support system.
Let me clarify, though, that in those 3 states where physician-assisted suicide is legal, if the doctor provides that patient a prescription for medication that would end their life, and that patient then goes home and takes that medication without the doctor being there, that's one thing. However, that legality of the physician-assisted suicide in those 3 states does not carry over for a family member to take that on themselves to do it for that family member.
Now,
so there is a difference.
Okay, now this is what I wanted to get to now. Has there been a push for a more liberalising even of those laws? I mean, clearly, it seems, the way you've painted it, seems fairly well defined, and obviously if these sort of things occurred with a doctor deciding to prescribe, and I guess there certainly would be ethical issues for some doctors in there. However, what about further liberalisation of those laws, and not only in those states, but of course, but in other states? Has there been much of an argument there like there has here? I mean, this is one of those issues certainly here that polarises people, because I find that people are either 100% for it or 100% against it. There doesn't seem, in my experience, to be a fence sitter, and I kind of imagine the situation would be much the same there.
In 2002, there was a Gallup survey, a Gallup poll, that showed that 72% of Americans supported euthanasia. However, in all the states where the referendum has been defeated, it's been by a resounding margin. How do you explain it? I don't know. I think people may talk a different philosophy, but when they go to the polls, there's also that fear factor, because you have the people who are on the religious right or the right to lifers who really demonize and make these straw man arguments that this will lead to the government deciding who has the right to life or not. So then a lot of people get scared when it comes to voting. When you take a poll, it's different, but when you cast your ballot, these referendums are not working out very well. I haven't seen it pop up here in a number of years. It's not something that really makes a lot of headlines when it is put on the ballot, and I think that has a lot to do with doctors being a little more conscientious to what their patients want, the best interest of their patients, and that's where I say there may be a lot of this going on in states where physician-assisted suicide is not legal, but there is that doctor-patient confidentiality that somebody passes away that had Alzheimer's or terminal cancer and no one questions it because they know they're going to die. How did they die? Whoever signs the death certificate knows better than anyone else.
So it's one of those things where sometimes you might conclude that there is an answer, but you're not really sure. Overall, how is the issue viewed over there? You said there hasn't been much of a conversation about it. Why is that so, do you think? Why is it something that hasn't really been in the forefront? I know it's been discussed here quite a bit, and look, it may be that because of people like Dr. Philip Nitschke who have spoken about it quite a bit, and also because, like take for example, there was basically a bill in the Northern Territory at one stage that allowed people to go there to seek basically to end their life if they wished. The federal government overturned that, but none of the situations that you've described to me seem to be active in the sense of, say, for example, clinics that operate in the Netherlands, and I guess the way that people like a Dr. Philip Nitschke have advocated. So clearly it's not something that has ever really come up as a big major issue there. I mean, obviously it's never been something that's been an election issue by the sound of things.
It probably has a lot to do with that we don't have nationalized medicine, so that you go to your private primary care physician. You can talk in confidence with that physician. If you can find satisfaction with that physician in your end-of-life needs, that's fine. Again, that's between you and your physician. So there really doesn't seem to be a huge public need for it. If those needs are being met, that's one thing. What I am seeing, though, unfortunately, is with the increasing age of our population, and because healthcare is so expensive over here, that I do see every few months a husband and wife do a murder-suicide. These are elderly people, very often well-to-do, where one spouse...
That's a very tragic set of circumstances when that happens, though, isn't it?
They have no other choice, because they have no other choice. Now, would physician-assisted suicide, if it were legal, curtail that? Perhaps. But it's still so hard to get into the mind and the hearts of people who are driven to that final act of desperation, where they feel there is no choice but for both of them to sever this mortal coil.
I suppose one of the other problems is, and I guess it's the same in your country, it certainly is the case here, that one of the great areas of concern here is suicide. I mean, I don't know what things like youth suicide rates and what have you are like in the United States. I imagine on a per capita basis they're probably pretty similar to ours. There are some very strong guidelines in this country in relation to that, because it's significant enough that it's a serious problem. You know, people who are self-harming for one reason or another, and so because of that, I guess suicide is suicide, and it doesn't matter what your reason is. And because there is a great concern about people who suicide for all the wrong reasons or who attempt suicide, and there is great concern. I mean, just the media information, just the media briefings you've got is basically a book about half the size of War and Peace. So it's something that groups take seriously, and I must say rightfully so. But the problem is, I guess, sometimes that for many people, they don't see a distinction between the two. And I guess in some instances, it is actually hard to clearly make a distinction between the two, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and that's why the laws in those three states are so specific, and the criteria is so specific about the person who is making that decision to have their life ended through physician-assisted suicide. There's witnesses the doctor needs to prove the person is of sound mind. They then go back after 15 days and ask if they want to do it again. Now, here in the U.S., there is no such thing as a right to die. Now, that comes up a lot of times in these referendums. It's not a legal right to end your life. It's a personal choice. Nearly all states in this country do not have any laws that say that it's illegal for you to commit suicide. For one thing, it's a moot point. If you committed suicide, then what are they going to do?
But you see, I don't know what the situation is there, but here it would certainly be illegal to assist in a suicide, to openly describe how a suicide would take place, or to actively advocate a suicide. It's one of the reasons why, even talking to you this morning, how we talk about this, I naturally are being very careful, because something said in the wrong way could actually put us in contravention of the law.
Yes. Over Here, that's quite different. We can say whatever we want and talk about any subject we want, short of things of treason or national security or advocating doing physical harm to elected officials or anyone else. But the Hemlock Society over here has been doing it for a number of years. Our First Amendment right protects discussion of information regardless of what it is. We're not trading military secrets. We're not talking about how to make a bomb or anything like that. But it is the social issue that needs to be discussed, and it is legal in 3 states, and it's not legal in most of the other states. As I say, it's not against the law to commit suicide. It is against the law, except in those 3 states, to facilitate someone's suicide.
Yeah, gotcha. I'm sort of surprised when we think about some of the other states that are fairly liberal, like California and what have you. I'm surprised it hasn't found its way into those states. Is there a reason why it hasn't?
It has. It's on and off in California. There's always been a push for it. Again, California voters are just as fickle as anybody else, as you can see by the recent gay marriage vote.
Oh, you mean Proposition 8?
It was recently overturned. Yes, Prop 8, and recently has been overturned, and now there's a stay still holding on gay marriages. As liberal as California may seem, they really aren't when they go to the voting booth. It has been presented in California, but when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, it has not been voted in yet.
Overall, what do you think is going to happen in the years to come? Is it something that's going to be more and more accepted, do you think? Or is it something that is probably going to be like it is here? It's going to have its advocates, but it's always going to be on the peripherals of society.
Well, what happened last year when Obama was trying to push his, and successfully pushed his Health Care Reform Act, is that the Republicans and the teabaggers kept creating the straw man about the death panels and saying if Obama passed his health care reform bill, that would mean that doctors can decide who lives, who gets medication, etc. That was totally false. All the bill did was it reimbursed doctors for end-of-life conversations with their patients. And more people are going in saying, here's what I want if I get to a point in my illness where I cannot think or act for myself. Here's what I want you to do. That's all that was in that bill. And as I say, I don't really see a big push for it or a big need as long as the needs are being met by the physician-patient confidentiality, then there really doesn't seem to be an issue. But it is such an issue that it's behind closed doors that we never know. Maybe you really have given me a mission impossible where I don't know the answer to this because I've not witnessed it myself.
My friend, as always, much appreciated. We'll have a chat again next week. In the meantime, if you'd like to be Richard's friend on Facebook, as we mentioned, Richard S. Kazimer is where you'll find him, Kazimer. Thank you once again, sir, and we'll have a chat next week.
All right, brother. Stay healthy.